guest this week is Paul Guzzo, a former colleague of mine from the Tampa Bay Times, who's done some magnificent stories uncovering lost cemeteries around Tampa. And by lost, I mean forgotten. Something similar to what happened to the German immigrants on I-4 happened to these places. Paul, you've been a journalist in Florida for how long?
Oh, since 1999 when I moved down here.
What sort of led you to writing about cemeteries? I mean, it's sort of an unusual topic. Certainly not a normal beat you find in most newspapers.
You know, it happened with kind of I don't know if you want to call any story about a cemetery lighthearted, but that was kind of how the story played out. I wrote about a guy, he spent his retirement years trying to document all the people who are buried in the all-people cemetery in Hillsborough County, which is basically the county potter's field from the mid-20th century. There's only a few hundred stone markers there with a number, and they correlate. And if you look up that number on the county's list, you know, because it was a potter's field for the poor and the indigent and the unknown. So if you look up that marker number on the list, you can find out who's buried there. But there's only a few hundred markers, but that cemetery had people being buried there since the early 1900s, and there are supposedly thousands of people buried there. So even though the county list only shows a few hundred. So he has spent his retirement years looking through death records so he can document everybody who is buried there. And that started because he says the ghost of the people who are buried there would visit him at his house and say, please bring dignity back to me.
Why him?
He lives around the corner. So, you know, and so whether you believe in ghosts or not, it doesn't matter. He's doing good work. Mm-hmm. So, and his name is Ray Reed. I'm sorry. So Ray Reed. So James Borchuk, the photographer, and I, we do a story on him, and it's like, hey, this guy sees ghosts, but he's doing good work. But when we get to interviewing him, he said, well, the real story is Zion Cemetery. I'm like, well, what's Zion Cemetery? He's like, well, I'm not sure. He's like, but while I'm looking for death certificates for the county poor farm, the Potter's Field, I keep finding death certificates for Zion. They're always black people, and it's not on a map anywhere in the county. We're like, what does that mean? He's like, that probably means they built over the cemetery. And we were like, well, that's
messed up, yeah.
But I looked up, I was like, I can't write that. He's like, that's the story. I was like, well, I can't write that. That's just a conspiracy theory. I kind of blew it off. I was like, that's way out there. And James is the one who's staying on me, Borchuk. He's like, no. He's like, he seemed really serious about this. And that guy knew what he was talking about. He's like, all right, we'll look into this. So we started looking into it, and we realized the cemetery, when we finally found on a map after like weeks of looking, was where the housing authority's Rebels Park is now located. And we're like, oh, boy. And that's really what started, I think, 9 months of research. Basically, the research wasn't to prove that the bodies were there, because we couldn't prove that. We had to do 9 months of research to prove we can't prove that they were moved anywhere. And once we could prove there's no evidence that they were moved, we could at least write a story saying, you know, hundreds of people were buried there. No one knows where the bodies went. Could they still be there? We wrote the story, and that kind of started this avalanche of research by archaeologists and historians, and they finally found, the bodies are still there.
Wow. Now, Rebels Park is low-income housing, right? So basically,
it's public housing. I'm sorry,
Then the city built that?
No, the Tampa Housing Authority, which is federal, they built it in the 1950s. And when they were building it, they did happen upon two caskets. And when they called the city and said, hey, we found two caskets while building, what is this? And the city said, oh, that's just from the old Zion Cemetery. That cemetery was moved in like 1923, which was not true because obviously. So to this day, I don't know where the city got that date from in 1950 and why they threw out 1923, but it was absolutely not true.
Man. So who was buried there?
It was, you could say, the pioneering black residents of Tampa. So Robles Pond, which was the name of the community where Zion was located, was one of the first all-black communities in Tampa. At the time, it was a few miles outside of city limits, and that was basically where, you're talking about the early 1900s, late 1800s, where black people could build their communities. They were not going to be welcome to build neighborhoods in downtown or South Tampa, so they would find those areas on the outskirts of Tampa where there was no development, buy that land. And so it was, and considering that was that we know for now, I don't want to say it was the absolute first all-black cemetery, because for all I know, in 3 months, someone's going to come forward with evidence it was a smaller one first. But I'll say it was the first major all-black cemetery in Hillsborough County. So it was a who's who of people were built there. The most prominent was a guy named L.G. Caro. He was a very prominent pastor. He was one of the few people who were licensed to marry black couples in the early 1900s. And when you read old newspapers clips, while they say he was one of the few who could, it seems like he was the only one who did. There were times where he was doing, a dozen or two marriages a day.
Wow.
He helped found Bethel Baptist Church. At one time, there was talk of him running for city council as a black man, and you're talking in a southern town in the early 1900s because he was that popular even among white people. He ended up not running, and he was, Carl was like the endorsement you needed if you were going to run as a white politician to get the black vote. A lot of the people we found were women who were raising prominent white families' children, including the sheriff at the time.
Oh, man.
Richard Dobie, who built the cemetery, one of his sons was buried there. Dobie died after the cemetery disappeared, so Dobie himself was buried in Memorial Park, but he buried his children there. And it was just, again, it was a who's who of black residents of the early 1900s. That was where you would be buried.
Was it adjacent to a church?
Yes. So the original church on that land was the Mount Carmel, which is now called First Mount Carmel, and they have since moved to another area of East Tampa because in the 50s, that whole section of Tampa got bought up for the housing projects. But so Mount Carmel was there, and they, from what we can tell from records, even though they didn't own the cemetery, would have ran the cemetery. There was a Zion church on that property that no longer exists. And there was one other Baptist church whose name we have yet to discover. So there's about three different churches surrounding the cemetery. The main one was the one on the back of the cemetery, which was Zion Church, which seemed to be the more popular one. The only woman left living who remembers Zion Cemetery said that was kind of the church where all the residents would go hang out to get out of the sun. They kept it open all day so they can go in and play the piano. And the woman, the woman who ran the church always had peppermint sticks for the children. That was the popular one.
How was it ultimately discovered that there were bodies still under this housing project, and how many bodies are there?
So they have found a little over 300. The ground penetrating radar discovered a little over 300, but there was around 800 people buried there that they know of. Mm-hmm. Now, but that's death records from around 1910 through the mid 1920s. But the cemetery was founded in the early 1900s. The problem is from around 1901, when we know it was founded, to 1909, they didn't put cemeteries on death records. So we know of about 800, but archaeologists believe there was probably close to 1,000 were buried there, and they're likely all still there. We met with the property owners prior to our story coming out in, June 2019. So we met with the Housing Authority, and we met with Richard Gonsmar, who, so the Housing Authority owns 5 buildings from Robles Park Village on the Zion property, and then Richard Gonsmar owned about the other half, uses it for warehouse.
Mention who he is. He's a big deal.
I'm sorry, yeah. Richard Gonsmar owns a Columbia restaurant. He owns Goody Goody. He could be considered by many to be our most prominent restaurant owner in Tampa. And so we met with them. And so the Housing Authority, by the time our story came out, had already contacted our archaeologists and said, look, this story's coming out. Once it comes out, we're going to know if this is true. So within a month of, the story came out, I think, in late June. And by early August, the archaeologists had already confirmed that there were coffins on the Housing Authority's property. And once they confirmed they were there, then Gonsmar obviously was like, well, they're on mine too. And then about a few months later, they took ground penetrating radar to Gonsmar, found them there. And then there's one basketball court-sized piece of the cemetery that is now part of a tow lot. And they then took radar there and discovered there that, yes, the full 2.5-acre footprint of Zion has coffins. And then a few months back, they kind of did some digging just to prove that what the radars detected was coffins were physical coffins. So they dug and were able, to find they only had to prove that there was one. Once they found one coffin, they said that means they're all coffins.
Wow. I think I know the answer to this, but how do you forget a whole cemetery?
We all think we know the answer, but I've been so careful to say we don't know for sure. Because we don't. Unless Bill and Ted visit me with a phone booth and take me back in time, I'll never know exactly. But historians say it was racism, right? But not racism in the way that there was some evil white developer twirling his mustache and saying, I want to go destroy a black cemetery. Historians have said they would have done this to a white cemetery if they could have gotten away with it. Basically, the city of Tampa was expanding, and while it was once smart to put cemeteries on the outskirts of Tampa in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because you didn't have the foresight to think Tampa would become this huge city one day. As Tampa expanded, developers said, well, now these cemeteries are in our way. And so they wanted them moved. So the Catholic cemetery, which was an all-white cemetery, which was next to Zion, and it's where the empty Sacred Heart Academy now is, That one was moved in the mid 1920s to Myrtle Hill. All the bodies were exhumed and moved. And when you read news clips about it, you can see what a careful and delicate process it was, where those whose families were buried there were meetings, and the families were there watching them exhume the bodies to make sure everything was done properly. And the reason that was done is because these white people had a voice. They could make sure that their families weren't treated this way, weren't treated badly, their loved one buried. Mm-hmm. But African Americans at that time did not have a voice. So when developers wanted to build on that land, no one was going to stand up for the black residents whose families were buried there. They had no way to stop this. So the developers just went and picked up the headstones and started building first a couple storefronts, then some small houses, and then they just kind of kept it an open field for years up into the 1950s when they sold it to the housing authority to build the apartments. And again, I need to stress, though, that just about every historian I've spoken to has said they would have done this. This wasn't just so much them saying we want to destroy a black cemetery. They would have done it to a white cemetery if they could have gotten away with it then, too. In the early 1900s, I guess there wasn't as much respect to any cemeteries as we would put on them today. Just black people couldn't stop this from happening where white people could.
And also there's this whole mindset in Florida of we pay no attention to our past. We only think about the future. Yeah. We only think about making a buck tomorrow and not about, honoring those who came before us. And so sometimes it feels like the whole state's run by amnesiacs, It's like, what do you mean there's a historic property there? The bulldozers are already cranked up. Let's go.
Well, and I mean, since we've learned since then, this is not the only black cemetery it happened to. I mean, we're still waiting for MacDill Air Force Base to release their report on what they found, because the Port Tampa Cemetery was on land now owned by MacDill Cemetery. Same thing. Those headstones were picked up, and people are saying the bodies were never moved. There was another one out in Odessa. Archaeologists are looking into that one, too. It was located on what is now a horse ranch. Headstones were picked up, not by the current owner, by owners in the 1950s, and the cemetery would, from what people who remember tell me, that the headstones were picked up, but the bodies were not. You've got the one on King High School's campus. That one wasn't a black cemetery, but it was a potter's field, which I don't think, I'm throwing this number randomly out there, but it was somewhere in the high 90% of all of them were black. It's happened we've got two different cases of this happening in Clearwater. And I get emails from people regularly when my story's published. Say, how come you're only writing about black cemeteries that are disappearing? Where are the white ones? And I don't know what to tell them. This just didn't happen to white cemeteries, because when those had to be moved, they did the right thing. With black cemeteries, they just said, forget it. Pick up the headstones and build.
Even beyond just this area, Tallahassee, the Capital City Country Club discovered that they were built there. I think it's the 7th fairway of the golf course is on top of a slave cemetery containing 40 graves, because the golf course is built on what used to be a 500-acre plantation.
Yeah, when we were doing our research, when James Borchak and I were doing the research, we reached out to archaeologists who specialize in finding African-American cemeteries, lost ones. And he sent us 24 examples of cemeteries that had been discovered under development in just the past 25 years. I mean, one of them was, I believe it was either an old courthouse that they were going to turn into a school. And I can't remember which city it was in, but they were turning an old courthouse into a school, and they were digging around the foundation to check the plumbing. They found actually pipes going through the coffins of the black cemetery that was there. So, and I mean, I can't remember when. It was sometime in the 1990s, right? They found the old cemetery in New York where there were thousands of slaves buried still underneath the city. They never moved them. Yeah, this happened. This is not just unique to Tampa, to the Tampa Bay area, but the fact that we have, over the past 2 years, they've discovered, half a dozen now, is unique, that it had occurred this many times. Mm-hmm. Or as some archaeologists have said, maybe it's not unique that it occurred this many times. Maybe it's just that Tampa's looking the hardest. And maybe you can find that many everywhere.
And that's a good point. It certainly didn't only happen to African Americans. It's going on right now with Native Americans on the borderlands for Trump's wall. The border wall is gashing sacred sites, burial grounds, some of the most important cultural and spiritual areas for Native Americans today. This is not from the 1900s, but they are still incredibly sacred ceremonial sites today, dating back thousands of years. And certainly the current administration doesn't give a rat's ass about that. So this, like you say, this is not a Tampa problem, nor is it strictly an African American problem. And I'm sure there are Indian burial mounds all over Florida and sacred sites that are now gas stations and convenience stores.
Well, and not just that, but a lot of our early inhabitants here, they subsisted on seafood, and so then they built middens, shell middens from the discarded shells, including some that were burial middens. Well, our early settlers in the late 1800s, 1900s, when they started building roads, they tore down the middens to use the shells as paving material. So, it's a lot of this. It's almost, us modern day folks, we saw the movie Poltergeist. Do we not? Why are we continuing not to heed its lessons, Well,
is it 3 or 4 times now in the past 20 years while developing in the downtown area, they've discovered graves dating back to Native American times, where it's not just the Fort Brooke soldiers who, the fort was in downtown Tampa, who they are finding there, but they've been finding Native American graves too.
You touched on this briefly, but what is the proper protocol in contemporary society with contemporary norms when a developer finds relics, whether that is of an archaeological nature, a paleontological nature? When someone's digging a hole for a store and they find bones, what are they supposed to do?
It depends. So you need to call the authorities and call the county medical examiners, like the morgue. If there was, and you have to stop construction immediately. If in your research there used to be a cemetery there, then the state archaeologist has to be informed also so they can come in. So anytime you're doing development, you have to go back. You have to go back to the land records. I believe it's 50 years to see what's been there. And if in that 50 years you find that there was a cemetery there, then when you are doing development, you have to have an archaeologist on your payroll just in case you do find something. If you know for certain beyond those 50 years that there could have been a cemetery there, like if it's well known. For instance, if you're building in downtown Tampa, there's a very good chance, not a very good chance, I'm sorry. There is a chance that there could be a Seminole or Fort Brooke soldier grave there. Then the same thing, you need to have an archaeologist help you discover before you start digging into the earth. Once a cemetery is confirmed to be there, you can't develop anymore. You can't build anything. You can't do anything that could disturb that land. You could move the bodies. That's costly. You could do that. There's nothing telling you have to keep the bodies in that cemetery. Or you could find a way to build your development in a way that does not disturb those bodies. So you can still build, but you can't drill into the ground and put this foundation in a way that's going to upset the grave. So, you could either move them, keep them there like they're doing with Zion, where they're just going to bulldoze all the buildings and turn it back into a cemetery, kind of like a memorial park. Or you could find a way to build without disturbing the graves, but you cannot disturb those human remains. Like you can't just destroy them.
Well, and that leads me into my next question. It kind of dovetails into how you finished. Since you're reporting, what has been determined about the way to treat this space moving forward?
The 3 property owners, which is the tow lot owner, Richard Gonsmark, the restaurant owner, and the housing authority, have agreed to reassemble the land, have agreed to reassemble what was Zion Cemetery's land. The housing authority is going to donate their property to the cause. The other 2 owners, since they don't have federal funds funding them, they're going to need to be reimbursed. So the city is helping to form a nonprofit. It will not be run by the city of Tampa, but they're helping to form a nonprofit that will operate independently of the government. That nonprofit will raise the money to buy that land from Richard Gonsmar and the tow truck owner, Dennis Creech, tow truck lot owner, Dennis Creech. And once all 3 properties are in the possession of the nonprofit, they're going to turn it into a memorial park. So obviously they're not going to put headstones everywhere. They're going to put one wall up that's going to list everybody who's buried there. There's going to be fountains and benches and a historic marker telling the story of Zion Cemetery. And it's going to be, a place where people can go relax. It'll be an open park. People can go there and throw frisbees if they want, but it'll be the Zion Memorial Park.
What happened to the folks in the housing authority building?
They were moved. So there was 5 buildings, and the moment that they announced that there were graves there, the housing authority began the process of relocating them to other public housing. So they were moved to either a HUD housing or another of the housing authority's housing projects somewhere. I think it was 29 total families. I can't remember how many individuals, but it was 29 units, and they were moved. It took, I believe, until January. Because it was right before the pandemic hit. Once they were all moved out. So then those 5 buildings have been boarded up and fenced off from the rest of the project, so that obviously people can't get into them.
How did those folks react to discovering that their homes were on top of cemetery that had been there for decades and then forgotten?
I only spoke to about, I'd say, a handful of them during the process. A lot of them didn't want to comment, but the handful I spoke to were freaked out by it. They were bothered. There were ghost stories at that point started going around, the entire complex, and you can imagine little kids hearing from their friends who don't live in those buildings, your house is haunted. We went into the buildings after they were vacated just to get a tour of what it looked like. And I mean, we went into one, and you could tell it was a children's bedroom because toys were left behind, and the kid-sized mattress was there, and somebody had drawn pictures of ghosts on the wall. So,
oh Lord,
oh yeah. I mean, I can't imagine, right? You wake up one morning and you're being told you're on top of the cemetery. It's got to be bothersome.
Wow,
especially if you're a spiritual person. I can't speak for all 29 families, but the 5 who I spoke to were spiritual and and believed in the afterlife, and they were bothered by it.
I can well imagine.
Paul, where did you? I'm going somewhere with this. Where did you move to Florida from?
Ewing, New Jersey, a suburb of Trenton.
Gotcha. Okay. I want to ask you and Craig both this question. It touches on something Craig mentioned earlier, and that is Florida's total disinterest in anything historical. And by historical, I mean older than built 6 months ago. There seems to just be no institutional memory in this state, no concern at all for the past. My theory would be because there are so many transplants here. I lived in Atlanta before moving to Amelia Island, and the same thing took place in Atlanta, where people came there from Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Chicago and everywhere. No one cared about what existed there previously, and it seems to me that Florida suffers, I guess is the word I will use, suffers from the same mindset where there is just no interest whatsoever in the history of this state, preserving it, interpreting it, remembering it, saving it, etc.
Well, there's one exception, unless you can make a buck off of it, like St. Augustine does.
Yeah, right.
Part of the problem is all these mysterious fires that seem to happen because, Craig, I'm sure you've run into this over the years when you're trying to find a document that dates back to like the 1930s, 40s, or 50s, and you call the specific government office, and they said, well, we used to have them, but there was a fire in the 50s or 60s, and we lost all our old documents. So apparently there was a rash of fires in file cabinets throughout the state in the 40s and 50s where all our old records were lost. And it always conveniently seems to be the ones that I need. So,
I'm sure it had nothing to do with some developer wanting to build somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Well, and they did have a rash of arsons in Ybor in the 20s for insurance fraud purposes.
You're right. When people would and I've even heard stories that some of the families who were filing insurance fraud actually own their own insurance companies, and then they would buy buildings, set them on fire. But I have no proof of that. Just a funny Ybor story. I don't need to know if it's true or not. It's a very Ybor story. Weird though. You're right, because I come from Trenton, and Trenton, I mean, it's a very historic city. I mean, as kids, we would ride our bikes across the Delaware Memorial Bridge over into Pennsylvania, where there would be all these historic homes from Revolutionary War times. And if you went, I can't remember what day it was. I think it was like a Tuesday after school. And they would still have colonial times ice cream prices for like a nickel. Yeah. And maybe it's because that history dates back to the 1700s and you grow up on it rather than people who grew up here, they had a hard time understanding that their childhoods were historic. If you're growing up in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and then you're older, maybe you don't see that old building as historic. It was just part of your childhood, as opposed to something from the 1700s is
old and matters. Yeah, and I lived in Connecticut for a while, and similar thing there. I mean, Mark Twain's house, Daniel Webster House. I mean, there are all these historic sites. Being born and raised in Wisconsin, I went to school at Auburn, and there is such a more interested community around preserving what was previously than there is here in Florida. And Craig, as a Florida native, what do you attribute that lack of concern over history to?
Well, like I said, we're all about, how am I going to make money today? What can I build tomorrow? and let's not get too hung up on history because a hurricane's going to wipe it out anyway. There's just such a sense of the ephemeral nature of things here in Florida that people don't necessarily think about. And like you said, a lot of them are transplants. They don't necessarily think about what happened before they got here.
Mm-hmm.
To them, history is a historic building is Cinderella's castle at Disney World. And they don't think about, the Castillo de San Marcos up in St. Augustine or, even some more recent stuff. I mean, heck, I live in a house that was built in the 1920s. There are several others in my neighborhood. Those are historic homes, but we don't necessarily think of it that way. A lot of times people think of, hey, let's buy that old house and tear it down and build something modern there, which goes on an awful lot here in Florida.
Paul Guzzo has been our guest, Tampa Bay Times reporter. You can read all his work online, Tampa Bay Times. Follow him on Twitter at P. Guzzo. That's 2 Z's and an O. P. Guzzo Times on Twitter. Paul, thank you so much for the time today. This has really been enjoyable.
Thanks for having me. Good talking to you guys.
It was great. Thanks.